Hello everyone, my name is Thor and welcome back to Anthropology. Thank you for joining me in today's video. I hope you're all doing well on this beautiful day. I'm back again and you may notice that I have a name tag on. So I'm going to be talking about Nordstrom's exit from Canada, why they struggled within Canada. This may be an old topic to some, but it's something that has still interested me as they sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater and completely left the market. Now, this is similar to a lot of other American brands that have done and tried to enter the Canadian market, sort of viewing it as an extension of the American market, and finding that that's not essentially the case and leaving with their tail between their legs. So we're going to be talking about the Nordstrom sort of rise and fall within Canada from a former Nordstrom employee, why I think it may have gone wrong, what they may have misjudged, and just general implications and comparisons to the Target's disastrous, miraculous disaster when they tried to come into Canada roughly around the same time. So if you're interested in this retail type analysis video, please keep watching. I'll insert some other videos down below if you're into my more analytical content. So without further ado, let's get into it. You may notice I have clipped my microphone onto my name tag because I don't want to hold it. For those that are unaware of Nordstrom, Nordstrom is a family-owned luxury department store chain based out of Seattle, Washington, United States. They were founded in 1901. They're sort of the Nepo baby of luxury department stores, if you will. They have quite a significant footprint in the States, sort of any large major city you go into, there will be a Nordstrom there. 2012 is when they decided to enter the Canadian market, and in 2014 is when they opened their first retail location in Calgary. Now, Nordstrom really wanted to grow into Canada as sort of an expansion of the United States, and I think a lot of American retailers view it as such. However, the Canadian market, I think a lot of companies overestimate how much money, disposable income, Canadians have to spend on goods, how willing they are to part with their tried and tested, their tried and true, their favorite stores, because essentially Canadians are a very loyal market. But this video will be broken down into a few parts. One around just a general understanding of who Nordstrom is, especially who Nordstrom Canada was, their general expansion strategy and why they potentially had some missteps there, the competitors and why Canadians potentially are very hard to sway away from their tried and tested lovers, and also comparison to Target as to what they maybe could have learned from Target, and also just some general downfalls of Target. Nordstrom, at their peak in Canada, the Canadian market roughly represented 3% of their total business, which is not large by any means. However, what's interesting to note is that the Vancouver store, which is the one that I worked at, I worked there from September 2017 to November of 2019 in the men's accessories department. The Vancouver store was the #1 store in the company, even up until the closure. So from 2015 when it opened up until 2023 when it shut down, the Vancouver store was the #1 store, bringing in almost all of the income for Canada, Nordstrom Canada, which is kind of crazy. In 2022, obviously, since Nordstrom is a publicly traded company, their financials are public, they sold $515 million Canadian worth of goods. However, they lost $72 million in the process. The reason for their closure was essentially that they couldn't find an avenue to profitability within the Canadian market. Even from 2014 up until 2023, the Canadian expansion, Nordstrom Canada, was unprofitable for them, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Now, their general expansion strategy and the goal for Nordstrom when they entered the Canadian market was to have a total of 15 Nordstrom Rack stores and 9 Nordstrom mainline stores. They never ended up reaching this total. They landed with 6 Nordstrom full-line stores and 7 Nordstrom Rack stores at the end, so they missed their target by quite a bit. However, their expansion strategy was quite interesting. As a Canadian, when I think about how they did it, they started in Calgary, which is a very small market. Calgary has a lot of oil money. Calgary's like the Houston of Canada, I would say, or like the Dallas. I don't know what the American equivalent would be. However, it's like Alberta's like Texas. And it's interesting they started there as opposed to starting in Toronto or Vancouver, which are the primary luxury markets. And like when I think of Nordstrom, I view them as a luxury department store. However, when they opened with a bang in Vancouver. From there, there was a subtle and sort of long drawn out decline away from luxury goods to more generalized goods, I think, as they were trying to adapt to the Canadian market. However, it's interesting that they started and basically only landed in 3 provinces. So it's interesting that they picked Alberta to start, and then they transitioned over to Vancouver and then subsequently Ontario. What was interesting about their expansion in Ontario is that they had a significant amount of stores. I think there was like 3 stores in Western Canada and then 3 stores in Toronto, basically, which is kind of crazy if you think about it, because the stores in Toronto were very large, and yet they kind of didn't have anything. Like anytime I went to like the Eaton Center one or the Sherway Gardens one, it was like totally giving me dust. And they essentially just became a different version of Hudson's Bay. And I think that's also what they misjudged about the Canadian market, is that the Canadian market is very loyal to a few brands. If you're familiar with the Canadian sort of commerce environment, we are like the land of monopolies. We have 3 cell phone providers. We have 1 insurance provider in BC. So it's a very small marketplace dominated by few chains. And in the luxury retail space, what I noticed when I was working at Nordstrom is that clients would come in and they would either want brand specific experience. So for example, you buy a Prada wallet. They wanted the Prada box. They wanted Prada tissue paper. They wanted the Prada bag. At the time, the store was also competing with Holt Renfrew. They were also competing with Harry Rosen. They were also competing with the standalone luxury stores that were providing the same product, but without the name factor. And I think that's something that Nordstrom got wrong when they came into the Canadian market, because the buyers were based in the States. And a lot of American companies do this when they try to expand into Canada, is that they treat the Canadian market as an extension of the American market. And yet how Canadians shop is different than Americans. We have different seasonality. Most of our product, and we're very brand specific, in the sense that if I was to buy a Prada wallet, Nordstrom wouldn't have necessarily been my first choice. I would have potentially gone to Holt Renfrew, as there's Prada concessions. I would have gone to the Prada store, because then you get the full luxury experience. And when I was at Nordstrom, they had sort of a very, very wide offering. Their view was a little something for everybody. However, it's like you could spend $5 on a pair of socks and get a Nordstrom bag, or you could spend $10,000 on a bag and still get a Nordstrom bag, if that makes sense. So the dilution of the luxury experience, I think, impacted them negatively in Canada, because there just wasn't that same level of experience, and there wasn't that same level of assortment that Canadians had come to expect when traveling down to the States and America. And this is something that Target also got wrong. Target's expansion was dramatically more intense than Nordstrom's. They went from 1 store in 2013 to 133 stores in 2015, which is absolute insanity. And yet they totally botched it, because Canadians were expecting to have American Target in Canada, and that just wasn't the case. I remember when I was living in Montreal, I went to one of the Targets when they opened. It was like, oh my God, Target's here, how exciting. But when we went into the store, half of it was empty. And they were massive retail spaces, often taken over like the Zellers or the Hudson's Bays that were there before. And yet they had no product and very little staff. So it was just and they often had higher prices compared to the primary competitor to Target was Walmart. And Walmart's huge in Canada. Canadians love Walmart. So they were competing with Walmart, which was already well established, which already had large assortments, major footprints, and yet they were offering less goods for higher prices. So it really fizzled in Canada, dramatically and very, very quickly. At the peak of Target, they had 17,000 employees in Canada, which is absolute insanity. And yet, if you think about Nordstrom, they expanded slower. However, they were still criticized for expanding too quickly, sort of opening 1 store a year up until 2018, which was their last Rack store. But even they tried to open a Nordstrom Rack store in Langley, BC, just outside of Vancouver, and they opened that in like 2022. Like Nordstrom currently operated 468 locations, bringing in a revenue as of 2021, 14.789 billion US dollars with 62,000 employees, which is interesting that only 515 million came from Canada. 400 of that million coming from Vancouver, approximately. And of the 62,000 employees, only 2,500 were Canadian. They said, despite our best efforts, we do not see a realistic path towards profitability in the Canadian business. From there, they went to third-party liquidators to completely liquidate everything. The liquidation was also quite disappointing, I would say. When I went in there, when I think of liquidation, I think of like blowout sale, 50% off, 60% off, 70% off. It really didn't start like that. It started at like 20% off, and then they were selling like things down to like the light fixtures, which was kind of embarrassing. I think what's also interesting is that according to the CBC, Canada is a perfect marketplace to test out e-commerce, given that the country is so geographically dispersed from literally Victoria all the way to Newfoundland. It's like literally bigger than most Western Europe. So it's the perfect place to test out an e-commerce model of shipping because it's so long. However, Nordstrom only introduced e-commerce, I think, around 2021, 2022. So they could have capitalized on this well before the pandemic. And that's another thing that led to their demise, the pandemic. People obviously stopped shopping as much. People were staying at home and people were transitioning, obviously, to e-commerce for shopping. But what Nordstrom offered was more of like a high-end business casual, even up to like business formal type offering. And people are just moving away from that. The Canadian market itself is very casual. We do have a few primary stores where we can get those like luxury goods, such as Harry Rosen, such as Holt Renfrew, such as even like Maison Simons. And I find that those heritage department stores, such as Harry Rosen and Holt Renfrew, to name a few, because of Nordstrom's exit, I believe they've really been able to flourish. Even Simons is set to take over 2 of the floors of the old Pacific Center location, which I think is, in essence, it is a good thing to have Canadian businesses flourish in Canada with less competition from outside companies such as Nordstrom. Now, I think how they did the exit was a bit botched. Apparently, the employees of the Nordstrom stores found out during a press release that that's when the stores were closing and they were all essentially being laid off. That is not really a good employee experience if you think about it. Like normally there should be like some type of heads up. Obviously it's very sensitive material, but the Vancouver location was the headquarters for Nordstrom Canada. That's where the HR sat, employee relations, all of that. And yet they found out at the same time as everybody else that they were essentially losing their jobs and losing their livelihood. Now, the Nordstrom fully exited Canada in June of 2023. I do think it's interesting that they closed every single store. Like surely they could have maybe kept open their most profitable stores like Vancouver. And I feel like when it shut down in Vancouver, it sort of left this empty scar on the downtown core because the store was massive. It was 230,000 square feet, spanning 3 levels. It was a beautiful store as well. So I think like how they closed everything, they sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater, the baby being the Pacific Center store, which is the one that I worked at. And I think that's led also to their slow decline ever since. Like if you look at Nordstrom's financials lately, they have not been great. And that's something that these legacy brands and legacy department stores really struggle with, such as like Macy's, TJ Maxx. Even in Canada, Hudson's Bay is trying to do a revival. And I think department stores as a whole are sort of really, really struggling because they're massive spaces retail-wise. And yet people have really changed how they shop because of the pandemic, primarily doing e-commerce or wanting to do more smaller boutiques or just wanting to do like direct from the brand. And I think that has led to where places like Harry Rosen and Holt Renfrew have really flourished in Canada is that a lot of the spaces that occupy these stores are leased spaces from brands themselves. So they sort of operate stores within stores, if that makes sense. And Nordstrom really didn't have that model. There were a few concession boutiques within Nordstrom, but in the beginning, it was all sort of like Nordstrom product. But then when I was there, sort of as time went on, a lot of the boutiques really took back their spaces and started to operate as mini boutiques within a larger store. And obviously that impacts Nordstrom's profitability because they no longer get the profit from selling the product, they get the profit from the lease. And clearly they didn't have any profit if in 2022, for the fourth quarter, they posted 119 million USD, down from 200 million the year before. And then the first quarter of 2023, they posted a net loss of 205 million US dollars, which is largely attributed to the loss of revenue through closing and obviously paying out severance for the employees in Canada. Now, just to compare to Target, so Target took over a lot of the Zellers locations. Nordstrom had taken over Sears, which was another failed US expansion. But what's interesting is that Target opened 133 locations in 2 years. Their main competitors being Walmart, Loblaws, Shoppers Drug Mart, London Drugs, Canadian Tire, and they had over 17,000 employees. They were failed and basically posted a net loss of $2.1 billion on this because they had an overly aggressive expansion, higher prices, and limited selection, especially compared to their competitors. Whereas Nordstrom essentially only posted a $200 million loss in their last quarter, and I guess like 72 million prior in 2022, where they had an aggressive expansion. However, they should have only opened Vancouver and Toronto, I would say, maybe even Montreal, because the stores I went to in Calgary, the stores I went to in Ottawa for Nordstrom were just like less impressive versions of Hudson's Bay. And Hudson's Bay Company is one of the oldest companies in Canada. And they operate primarily as like obviously a department store, but they were competing for the same customers. And as I mentioned before, the Canadian market is very loyal given that we have so few options and we essentially live in like the land of monopolies. Like if you think America is bad for monopolies, just like wait until you see Canada. So it's very hard to escape that consumer mindset of being like, well, I've always shopped here and like my parents shopped here, so I'm going to shop here. Whereas if something new tries to break into the market, they often face difficulties because they either approach Canada as an extension of the United States, which we are not. We have 10% of the population. We are significantly smaller in terms of like spending power, given that Canadians earn less than Americans on average. And also we have significant import-export tariffs, all of that. Now I'm going to speak to this as my experience as an employee there and what I noticed. I feel like if Nordstrom would have truly either picked a lane, either staying more for the affordable products or going directly into luxury goods and staying luxury, I think that would have helped them. If they could have emulated the Vancouver store across either like having one store like that in Toronto and having one store like that in Montreal, it would have been better for them. However, I don't think the Canadian market is strong enough economically with enough purchasing power to really hold that many luxury boutiques. Holt Renfrew dominates the Canadian market in terms of luxury goods as department stores. There's one in every major city. And Holt Renfrew is like a legacy brand. And I think obviously through globalization, we get access to a variety of brands that we haven't had access to before. However, given that the Canadian market is so small, we really have a primary focus on legacy or heritage Canadian brands and really sticking to that. And I think what we're seeing, especially with all these brands like pulling out of Canada, whenever I go to the States, I see so many products. So many products I've never even like dreamed of. It's almost like overwhelming. And then coming back to Canada, it's like we have like barely anything in comparison. And I think that's what a lot of people expected of Nordstrom and primarily of like Target as well, to be given that same experience, but adapted to the Canadian market. And I don't think they did enough market research really to understand like what the consumer wanted or who the consumer even was, because the buying offices were in Seattle. So they sort of just treated Vancouver as like, okay, well, like if this works in Seattle, then surely it'll work in Vancouver. And to an extent, yes, but that didn't really translate to other markets like Calgary or Edmonton, which is like such a random one. And then it's interesting that they also like really disregarded the central provinces and Quebec. Quebec, I understand because Quebec has significant language restrictions. So they would have had to really adapt to like a new market within a new market. And I guess they just like really didn't want to do that. Let me know what you think. Obviously, it's been a while now. They shut their doors. Do you think that, do you even like, do people like Nordstrom still? Like, what's the view of Nordstrom in America at this point? I remember when when we were in Hawaii in January, we went to a Nordstrom in, I don't remember, I think it was like Ala Moana. And I was just like, this is like, I don't know, it was like kind of empty. Like it wasn't really giving. It was sort of like a mid range luxury department store, if that makes sense. Like lots of Marc Jacobs, lots of Kate Spade. But it wasn't really operating in like the really high luxury spaces or in like the lower, more accessible spaces. And then there also is the issue of Nordstrom Rack, which is sort of like the off, like the outlet version of Nordstrom. And they tried to open a few in Canada. I went, or they opened 7 actually, which is more than their mainline stores. And I went to a few of them, but it was just like just junk, really. So let me know what you think of this video. Let me know what you think of Nordstrom, of Target, of just generally. If you're Canadian, what did you think? If you're American, what do you think of the Canadian market? Let me know anything down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye, guys.